They did not have enough within themselves, and they looked to God. The problem is that this lawyer hasn't gotten to that step, so he's not looking to God, because if he looked to God, then when he looked to him, God would show him, I've given you Jesus. Life will always follow purpose. God had a purpose for us, and that was to be a reflection of him. But we blew it. We blew it bad. When we go back to the first folks, Adam and Eve, they had within them a heart to be justified outside of their design. They wanted to do it different. God had created them to be in the garden, to be his image, to be a reflection of who he was. But then a serpent shows up and introduces temptation. Now, the temptation isn't the problem. It's the action on the temptation that causes the issue. So the serpent comes in and he says, well, you know God's lying to you, don't you? You know that God's withholding from you the ability for you to be God. All you've got to do is eat this fruit and you will be God. And so the temptation sits on man's heart, and man says, man, it really would be good if I was God. I wouldn't have to take orders from nobody. I wouldn't have to be a reflection of anybody. I would be the one who justifies myself. And Eve takes a big old bite, and before we blame her, she then turns to Adam, who did nothing while she was eating. Do you ever wonder if Adam's like, I'm just going to let her eat and see what happens first? Come on, guys. You ever wonder if Adam was like, what's going to happen? Yeah, go ahead, honey. Take that first bite. Let me just see. Nothing happened. She turns and she gives it to him, and he says, well, bottoms up. And Adam goes for it just like Eve. And then it hits them. Something's wrong. Something's very, very wrong. Because we are naked. Now, I don't want you to miss this out. Miss this out? That doesn't even make sense. I don't want you to miss this. There we go. Here's what's happening. The Bible tells us in Psalms that when Adam was created, that God crowned him with glory. And the word for crowning in that particular verse is envelop. They were enveloped in the glory of God. And so as reflections of God, Adam and Eve, a reflection of our Heavenly Father, they were crowned with glory. I believe they were just glowing. I really do. But that crowning, that enveloping was like their clothing. And the minute that they step out and say, no, I want to be my own, is the minute that the glory departs. And they find themselves in a position where they've never been before. They are uncovered. They don't have any glory. And they find themselves naked. Now, it's interesting. The Bible tells us that once that happens, that they try and go and get fig leaves to cover themselves. Now, interesting thing about when we look into as far back as we can go in man's history, that the culture around the time that even when Moses was writing, they believed, and it is very true, that fig leaves have medicinal power. They have the power to heal. And they'd be used in different concoctions so that if someone were ill or if something went wrong with somebody, that they would take these leaves and then they would either crush them or arrange them in certain ways, make them into a tea, that kind of thing. And then they would drink or let the healing power of these leaves fix them. It's interesting that in the Genesis account, the first thing that they look to do is cover themselves with something that can heal them, because the glory has departed and something very wrong has happened. Then we know what takes place. God comes down and Adam blames it all on God and Eve. It's not my fault. It's your fault that you gave me this woman and she did it and you did it and I'm totally fine. And then Eve was like, no, it wasn't my fault. It was the serpent's fault. And you know, she didn't even blame Adam, even though she probably could have, been like, that homeboy was right there. He didn't do nothing. But anyway, she doesn't. She just blames the snake, and so it's not any of their problems. For Adam, it's God's problem and Eve's problem, and for Eve, it's not her problem. It's the serpent's problem, and God says, no, it's your fault. And so then he clothes them with the skin of an animal, and then they are sent out, and they are unable to be in the presence of God. And from that point forward, we see the nature of sin destroy mankind. It begins to take root in Adam and Eve's children. Cain is overcome by the same nature and destroys his brother Abel in jealousy and fury. And so it goes on. Cain's kids, and even in Seth's line, it's found, and it just becomes such a mess that God gets to the point where he repents for even making man. And you know how Noah's story comes about, and God preserves Noah, and through that, God recreates the world through Noah, but it's not done because Ham has his issue with Canaan, and now Canaan's a mess, and sin just permeates and shows itself to be constantly at a fight with God's ways and God's will and God's plan. God has a plan to overcome sin. But until that plan comes into being, he creates a safeguard through the law so that people can understand this is the heart of God. This is the plan of God. It is that law that is going to reveal the real problem. The law was instated not to perfect man, but to remind man that the issue is not the rules, the issue is the heart. The law is a constant statement that there's a problem going on inside of you. There is an issue in your very personality, and that is an issue that is constantly trying to say, I don't want God to be God, I want me to be God. And the law is there to show you that that's the issue, not the law, not the rules, not the world, not the money, not the government, not the politics, not all the stuff. The problem is you. And we don't like that because we want our own way to be God. And so what man does is he denies the law of God, and then he goes and creates his own religion. He goes and he creates his own law where he's trying to achieve what he thinks in his mind will allow him to be God. And even in those religions, man fails. Because even in man's own rule sets, the heart of sin says, I will be governed by nothing. I won't even be governed by my own rules. And so this nature that exists is what Jesus has come to deliver us from. He has come to give us a new heart. That's why David was crying out. He said, God, I need you to create in me a new heart. My heart is the problem. Create in me a clean heart. Oh God, renew a right spirit within me. Now, I want to point to some similarities because if we look at where both the Pharisees and the Sadducees were, it's very similar to where our culture is now. Because both the Pharisees and the Sadducees are going to point to the fact that inside of you is what you need to get back to God, to get back to what you need. Now, in our society, we're not saying look inside of your heart to get back to God. We're saying look inside of your heart to get back to a better you. Because we value our intellect, our technology, and our capability as being heaven on earth. Don't believe me? Look at how we market products. We tell people constantly that as long as you have enough money, as long as you have the perfect relationship, as long as you look really good, you will be happy. It's amazing that we have not come to the conclusion that they're wrong yet. It's like we buy the product and we don't get it, and we don't actually look at the reason that we bought the product. We blame the product. The product was supposed to make you happy. It didn't make you happy, so now you're mad at the product. Oh, well, it's the product's fault. Maybe not. Maybe it's what you were sold on, which isn't the product. Maybe it's that you were sold on you could achieve something that will give you the satisfaction, that will give you the purpose, that will give you what you're supposed to have to be happy. My friends, you were created to be a reflection of the King of Glory. And any time that you try and achieve on your own, you will not be a reflection of him. You'll be a reflection of you, and it'll be a letdown. That's where death lives, is when you try and be the best you. You were created to be a reflection of God. You were created to have a relationship with the King of Glory. And when we deny that and go after our own ways, that's where death is. And the wages of sin is death. But life follows purpose. So it's interesting when the law comes to reveal, even to a lawyer, that the problem is not the law, but the problem is the heart. Here comes the lawyer saying, it's not my problem, it's everybody else's, and let me prove it. Jesus, how do we get eternal life? And Jesus says, well, look at the law that you say you know. The answer is there. And he comes up with the wrong answer. He says, oh yeah, well, all I got to do is this. And Jesus is like, yeah, go do it. Why? Because Jesus knows that if the lawyer really tries to do it, he's going to find that he can't. And then he's going to have to ask the question, why can I not do this? And that's where the answer is, you have a nature that's the problem. And if you have a nature that's the problem, there's only one person who can help you, and that's God. So the law will actually lead you to look to God for your salvation. That's what happened with David. That's what happened with Moses. That's what happened with Abraham. And they all realized they did not have enough within themselves, and they looked to God. The problem is that this lawyer hasn't gotten to that step, so he's not looking to God, because if he looked to God, then when he looked to him, God would show him, I've given you Jesus. He's right in front of you. Like literally right there. But he hasn't got there, so Jesus has to point him back. And so what does the lawyer do? Well, let me just justify myself. So come on, Jesus, who really is my neighbor? And that's how we do it. We seek to justify ourselves by twisting what God says to our benefit. Well, you can't love everybody all the time. That's too tough. Just do your best at loving the people that, you feel like you can love, and that's what God is looking for. You see how subtle of a twist that is? Oh, listen, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying really, really hard. That's all that God cares for. As long as you're trying really, really hard, that's all that matters. And what happens when we follow after that logic is we end up in more and more failure anyway, which is supposed to draw us back to the law to find the real problem. But what we do is we blame the action. We don't take any responsibility. That's the nature of sin. So that brings us to the next portion where Jesus answers with a story. I love how Jesus just answers with a story. Listen, some of you know what I'm talking about because you've walked with Jesus for a long time. Sometimes we go before the Lord because we want an answer to our circumstance, and the Lord does not give us the answer that we're looking for. And he starts dealing in totally different areas of our life where we're like, Jesus, come on, man, I just need this answer, right? Like, here's one. I think someone needs to hear this. God, I'm really needing some finances in my life. I'm really needing your answer. You promised that there would be provision for me. You promised that you would just pour out the windows of heaven for me. I need to see that provision. Why is that provision not happening in my life? And you're seeking the Lord and you're praying. You might even get crazy and go fast about it. And the Lord's like, well, here's the thing. I'm worried about your heart. And you're like, no, God, I'm worried about my money. My heart's doing fine. And God's like, no, I'm concerned about your heart. And you're saying, no, God, look, it's the money, man. I just need the cash. And God's saying, you remember that issue of jealousy that you never dealt with? No, I'm dealing with it, Lord. And if I had money, I could easily deal with the jealousy. And God says, no, the problem is you're jealous. And so what you're doing is you're spending the money that I'm blessing you with on trying to outdo the person you're jealous over. And if you would just get the jealousy right, you wouldn't have the problem with the finances. That's an example. There's many other examples. Okay, and so we're seeking the Lord for this one thing, and he's over here, and we're like, God, what are you doing over there?